So I just put together based on little coaching from Dan and Megan about some of the products or the standards that we work on that you are very familiar with, and then I added a few that you may be not as familiar with that are coming up. So it's really just SEI's overview of what we know is coming up. I would say in the near term that do leverage environmental hazard data. Um, this is our table of the documents that are coming, and in SEI, they're looking like they're all standards. This last one we're going to talk about here next. These are the two new ones that we haven't been talking about a lot. ASCE 32, Design and Construction of Frost-Protected Shallow Foundations. And the last one that is just brand spanking new, minimum design loads for structures supporting overhead power lines and wired telecom infrastructure. So I'm going to go through each of these four in a little more granularity, kind of lingering on ASCE 7 as that's the one that we have been talking about the most to understand. But these two documents kind of work together. So we've talked a lot over the past, gosh, how long have we been doing this, Dan and Bilal? So through 2, 3 years, something like that, of
At least
ASCE
four.
7. Okay, four. Time flies, I guess, right? The data that goes into ASCE 7, and then the same data that's used in ASCE 24. So like as a real high level overview for any folks who are still coming up to speed on what these documents are, ASCE 7 is minimum design loads for and associated criteria for buildings and other structures. So this is the document that's used and adopted into all the building codes nationwide to determine your loads on your buildings and other structures. So this includes all the hazards you see on the left-hand side, um, environmental and I would say environmental hazards, but also seismic and tsunami, which is a seismic event, as well as our dead and live loads on the structure. So those are people and the weight of materials, as well as structural fire loads. Not wildfire, structural fire loads. So in this document, we take all the hazards and we take our desired performance for both economical design and construction, kind of mix it in the magic pot here of 722, and what comes out the other side is intended to be your safe and reliable structure. So it really is dependent on these hazards. And I've talked quite a little bit. I've made a lot of presentations on where these data sets come from. I'm not going to do that today, but I'm sure it's in the archive if you're curious, or I can help anybody else who might be new to this document. And the ones that we really focus on for these conversations are the environmental hazards that are affected more by the impacts of a changing climate. So those would include wind, tornado, snow, ice, flood, and rain. So those are the ones that we've been looking at in much more detail for not only this document that's coming up, but the future conditions chapter that we've all been alluding to going forward. And as I mentioned a little bit, ASCE 24 relies heavily on the information that is developed in 722. So 722 is the loading standard. Think about it like that. 24 is the design and construction standard, and it pulls those loads and some of those criteria directly from 7. So those two really do go together, even though they're not published at the same time. They're two separate committees. They work in series. So 7 will finish its work first, and then we'll go to 24. So you can see the dates. Our last published 7 was 2022, and our last published 24 happened to be in 24, which we all think is very cheeky that it's 24. However, moving on. So these documents are well underway. And here's kind of where we're sitting right now. So we're in the process of working towards the development for ASCE 7 to 2028. That's the next edition of that document. We will be done in 2027. And the reason we finish in 2027, even though it's a 2028 document, we really publish it really late in 27. So that standard then can make it into the building code adoption process. Again, different presentation. I'm not talking about that today, but if we want to look upstream to where that data has to come from, we have to start thinking about these data sets well in advance of the publication date so that we can work with really good partners like NOAA and FEMA, USGS to get those data teed up that are going to be ready to be consumed by the standard development process and then published in the document. So right about now, like last year, 2025, is when we were pretty much buttoning up all new information for ASCE 728, believe it or not, 3 years in advance. So we're tracking pretty well with most of our balloting. Uh, we could talk all day about where they are in their process, but we're kind of buttoning up where we are on all of the I would say outgoing ballots and things like that. As Mike alluded to, I wasn't in the call, but there was a call recently, last couple days maybe, on where is future conditions landing. So again, kind of backing up the bus a little bit, the ASCE 722 will include all of the hazard data that we have developed for every edition of the standard up until now, which is a kind of a historic process. We look backwards and see what happened in the past, and that kind of sets the new bar for what we put in the new standard. In addition to that, we are also developing a new chapter in ASCE 7, which is chapter 36, which will include all of those environmental hazards that are here highlighted in red that will be affected by a changing climate. And we want to put those into a separate chapter that is going to start looking forward. So we'll have our historic basis of how we develop the hazards, and we'll also have a new chapter that's looking forward. So you've heard a lot of folks kind of allude to that. And this is kind of, this will answer Bilal's question of where are we landing with some of these hazard data sets for chapter 36. You see the warning up there. This is still under development. I know they're still tweaking their final provisions, I would say, but I think they made it through main committee, and now they're just doing ROCs and they're working on the final. So again, still under development, but this is the direction that they're intending to go in. So those are the six hazards that I talked about earlier. Flood, they are definitely looking towards incorporating new data sets for flood. We have traditionally, and Mike mentioned this, pointed to the FEMA flood maps. However, in ASCE 7, we do not have a reference-based data set for flood. We point to that jurisdiction and those FEMA maps, and it really is up to the design professional to understand what's happening in that local area. That's the data that they need to use. Every other hazard, except rain, has those data sets incorporated into the standard. So as Mike was mentioning, we have the entire data set for all of the seismic data that is included by reference into the standard. That's where the hazard tool comes in. You go and you grab your exact value, and that's the one that is required by the standard. It's a little different for flood and rain because we don't have a static data set for those hazards. They evolve over time. We don't have a real good base data. So going to 28, we have two really good things that are happening with the flood and the rain data sets. With the discussion, it was really nice and timely that we had the discussion on Atlas 1415 this morning. The committee is looking to bring in, if possible, a reference to Atlas 15, the volume 1, the new base version for base rain, and then use some of that going forward into the chapter 36. So we'll see about timing, if it's possible or not. I'm not quite sure based on what Fernando said. So we'll see. But I highlighted here for flood, for the future conditions, that the committee is really looking to use the 2022 interagency data set. They were having a little bit of an internal debate about which set to use, but I think that as of 2 days ago, as Mike mentioned, they've landed on using maybe the gridded data set from that application. So there's still things that are in flux. There's still decisions to be made about how they actually grab that, what they grab, what they're going to reference, things like that. But every other hazard, you can see I've highlighted the word factor. So they're looking at creating a factor that they will use to modify the base hazard criteria for future conditions. So there is still a discussion, as Mike mentioned, do we create a new visual that appears in the tool that is the factor already multiplied by the base hazard? Is that going to be our new map? Or are we going to provide the factor and the design professional does the calculation? So there's a little bit of decision making still to happen, but I think the technical decisions have been concluded for the most part about where they're landing on how they're doing this. Now, if you recall, and I put in here the figures that we're pointing to, as Mike had mentioned earlier. We try to be very clear about where all this information is coming from. The ICE loading is a little different, as they're working towards developing a delta, like a differential for what the increase might be for the ICE in those areas that are sensitive to that hazard. So that they're still working on that. However, we're landing in this kind of a place. And as Mike mentioned, all of those base hazard layer values would be provided in the hazard tool along with a new Chapter 36 value, future conditions value. So that's kind of in the direction we're going. So this is repetitive for some folks who have been doing this, as Dan said, for 4 years. But early on, we didn't really know where this was going to land. And we had to make some decisions about what data sets we were going to use, what data was available for us to use, and then do some engineering, best practices to get us to a place where we felt comfortable going forward. So we're closing the book on ASCE 728, which sounds funny because we're sitting here in 2026, but that's the truth. That's how it works. But we will very quickly be pivoting to what do we need for the next edition of 7, which is ASCE 2034. So it's every 6 years we do 7. And then again, all those documents that rely on 7 will just kind of pick up what that committee decides. So 7 is a very key critical document to include a lot of this good decision making on data sets, where it comes from in the hazard. So it's a nice timing to be thinking about this as 2028 is closing down its work. And as Chris Clavin mentioned at the top, we did some really good work with NIST with some a series of workshops to identify which which research are needed to really advance both hazards and more understanding of the load effects from those hazards for future conditions, as we start to build a research roadmap for certain components of this document development, future codes and standards. So I think it all fits together nicely. I think we're all working in the same space, but none of it is duplicative. So that information will be another really good tool for this group to start chewing on and maybe kind of incorporating into your spreadsheet, Dan, or some of the other speakers' presentations about what is needed. And if we're looking for the same information that EWRI is looking for some of their information, maybe that one bubbles up to be, more important, which I think is the goal of all of our collective work here. So that's kind of where we're landing with 7 and by reference with 24. And then the last 2, I just want to go over real quickly. We haven't talked about them in a long time. So this document, Design and Construction of Frost-Protected Shallow Foundations, is used almost exclusively in the permafrost area, really heavily used in Alaska, the upper continental United States, and in Canada. And so this committee, they just reaffirmed this standard. So you see on the cover, it's quite old, from 2001, and it was reaffirmed just last year. And the committee is working again in earnest to start looking at the data. And so they have a keen interest in understanding more available data around design air freezing indexes. These are the old maps that you see at the bottom of this slide that I pulled from this document, but they're looking to update those and understand what other data is available. The committee also is trying to, right now they have the question in front of them is, do they stop at the border, or do they go up and do the entire northern latitudes into Canada? So they're still kind of working on that, and if that data is available, et cetera, et cetera. So they're working on that. This has an anticipated publication date of 2029. So they're just starting to get started, but this will be a nice uh, topic for us to explore within this group about what is available in this area. We haven't looked at it in a really long time. And then the last thing that I want to bring forward is this new standard. So this has been published as an MOP, Manual of Practice 74. You can see on the screen there, that's the third edition that was published, I think, last year. And now they're ready, the industry, the committee is ready to move this into a standard so that utilities can start adopting the standard, and we have a similar a similar basis of design for all of our electric transmission structures across the country, because it's not so right now. It's kind of up to the utility. So we're moving into a standard here. And again, those hazards traditionally for the MOP have come from ASCE 7. So again, it highlights why 7 is just such a critical document for all these other ones. But they do look at things a little bit more closely for the unique structure that is the transmission structures. They're very sensitive to ice. They're very sensitive to in-cloud icing and ambient temperatures that might cause icing from freezing rain and things like that. So they have additional environmental hazards, I would say, that are not currently included in 7 in a way that is useful for this document. So they will also be looking at that. And then I just talked to the committee a few weeks ago, or maybe I say that, and it was probably like in the summer, you guys, but I just talked to them, and they're also looking to incorporate new content. I don't know where it's going to land yet, but new content on future conditions. So getting them kind of looped into what's happening at ASCE 7, get them looped into the resources that have been made available to 7 and some of these other partnerships with data developers would be really critical for them as well, as they start thinking about the unique needs that they might need beyond what's in 7, again with that icing load that is really critical for these types of structures. So that is coming online. They're cruising pretty quickly along this, and they anticipate that they'll be done in actually, I think it was 2020. Yeah, this one's 2029. Sorry, I think I messed this up. This is 2030. I messed this up. This is, anyway, not that you guys care. But anyway, so those are the documents, Dan, that I wanted to talk about from SEI that are kind of really tied to these what we discuss here is kind of identifying data sets, identifying data needs, what might be new, what we haven't done before. And so those are the ones that I wanted to bring forward. That's it. That's me. You know where I'm at. And that's all I have for you today.
All right. Well, thank you, Jennifer. I mean, that was you exceeded my expectations. So thank you so much. Um, what I'd like to do, does anybody have a pressing question for Jennifer? Because what I'd like to do is move on to maybe some of the other institutes, so we can
Um,
then maybe talk about this more holistically. But questions for Jennifer, real quick?
I have just a quick comment. It could be a question, but it's really more of a comment. I mean, we know based on interaction with different communities dealing with wildfire and flooding and even the seismic area, maybe less than the seismic area. Always the question that comes up is how the community feels about that risk in the sense of being risk neutral or risk averse. I mean, there are sometimes after an event, communities and even companies that could become risk averse, and they are willing to spend more to make sure that in the future the losses will not be as extreme like what was experienced recently after an event. So the question that I have, or the comment, how can we account for that risk aversion? Even I could ask it differently. What is the what is the risk aversion or the risk attitude that's implicit in setting up Chapter 36? Is it risk neutral or is it risk averse? And to what extent is it risk averse? I mean, it's almost you could translate it into, we know the future projections, there are different scenarios or different assumptions that could be made. And it might be worthwhile as a comment back to the committees is really to make a statement to that effect that we are assuming some level of risk aversion or something, or maybe give them the option to work with the different risk attitudes. And I have specifics about that. And if there is a need for specific language and even guidance of how it could be done based on the wildfire work that was done recently, I'm happy to provide input. But I think that could become a question when the chapter is released, is what is the default setting that we have in here in terms of the risk attitude? Thank you.
Jennifer, if you want to respond to that, that's fine. What I'd like to do is kind of move along. I mean, there's a lot there to unpack.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
by the way,
Yeah.
I forgot to thank you,
yeah,
Jennifer. Excellent
Yeah.
presentation. Thank you very much. Yeah.
right. So I just, I think let's digest that and then we can think about it because it is tied into the business case and tied into how people use scenarios and a variety of different things.